Santa Cruz Mountains 120 years ago, 110 years ago, was known as the best wine producing area in the United States. Actually, wine producing started in the Santa Cruz Mountains in the 1850s, and it was in the 80s and the 90s that it reached its peak. And through competitions conducted by the state in Sacramento, and through competitions in Europe, in London and Paris and Berlin, the wines of the New World were judged by many of the people there in the wine industry, and wines from Santa Cruz Mountains were judged as the best available from the United States at that time. Now, unfortunately, after the turn of the last century and approaching Prohibition, the wine industry died out in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And a little contrast is that at that time there were probably 5,000 to 6,000 acres of grapes in the Santa Cruz Mountains. Today, there's 500 to 600 acres of grapes in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And as opposed to in the 40s, 50, 60 years ago, there were probably less than 200 acres. So it made a dramatic change. And at that time, 100 years ago, the farmers changed over from grapes to orchards, pears, prunes, apples, cherries, fruit trees like that. In fact, this piece of land 100 years ago was a vineyard, and it changed over. Again, the owners and the operators changed over to fruit trees. It was pears and prunes and cherries. And then when I found the property in the early 70s, 72 actually, it was an abandoned orchard. But after I cleared what was left of that, those trees that was here, I also found that there were a few grapevines left over from prior to the orchard. And they were actually on the very steep slopes that were too steep to replant and work as an orchard tree. So there's about a half an acre down here of old vines that have been here for well over 100 years. They're all intermingled with the brush and the trees. It's what was the precursor to the Thompson seedless. It was the Thompson with seeds in it, or another one called a Palomino, something similar to that. It was an old white grape that we have no use for these days. I don't think there's any producing vineyards, commercially producing vineyards, that are left over from 100 years ago here. There are some in the Sierra foothills and some in Sonoma County that are rare, but there are some, and people have been able to take care of them, and they're still producing. And most of them are Zinfandel. Seems like the Zinfandel was the most popular 100 years ago. And I think Zinfandel, I love Zinfandel wine. I think that the grapes and the vines were very fortunate that some of those did survive and are still being taken care of. Because the situation with old vines is, and the Zinfandel is a good example. As the vine gets older and older, it produces less fruit as it gets older. However, the fruit, that smaller amount of fruit that it does produce, smaller berries, less berries, more intensely flavored, which is what we're always looking for. Most intensely flavored berries in wines to get more complex and more intense flavors in the wine itself. There was a lot of Riesling, a lot of German style grapes, Riesling and Gewürz. I think they were doing all sorts of different varieties, because 5,000 acres, there's going to be a lot of varieties and a lot of different people making their own type of wine.
And if it was the major producer for the United States or California then?
Well, I wouldn't say the major producer, but as a producer that produced the most flavorful and the best quality wines. One of the major producers though, but in Southern California at that time, there were thousands of acres of grapevines also. And then Santa Clara Valley, there were, I don't know about thousands, but certainly hundreds. When the wine industry came back after Prohibition, it started up with like gangbusters, if you will, in Napa and Sonoma. There were a number of reasons why it died out here. Part of it was Prohibition, but part of it was also the mechanization of farming. For example, the first tractors could only operate in the valley floor. So it was more efficient to operate the vineyards down there with the new tractors. The tractors could not come up in the hills. The people up here were more independent, and the people, the negotiants, if you will, who were based in San Francisco and essentially bought and sold all of the grapes and the wine, they seemed to be able to deal much more easily with farmers in Napa and Sonoma as opposed to farmers in this area here. So there was a number of reasons why the industry shifted north as far as the quality wine producer.
Cantankerous mountain folk.
Cantankerous mountain folk, exactly, exactly. And then finally, in the 50s, why the wine industry started to come back to the Santa Cruz Mountains. And then, for example, in the Santa Cruz Mountain Wine Growers Association was first formed, and the appellation was first formed in the mid-70s. And there were probably a dozen wineries at that time. And then in 79, when Silver Mountain joined, I think we were number 19. And now there are 53 wineries in the Santa Cruz Mountains.